This is lesson 3. When you start working with Flash graphics, and especially when you start adding your first symbols to the library, a source of confusion may often be the difference between a registration and a transformation point. As you may have seen in some of the other lessons in this chapter, you can actually set a registration point when you convert any graphics on the stage to a symbol. But what is the difference between a registration and a transformation point, and how do we manipulate both? To get started, go ahead and open up the fl03_video.fla lesson file. If we take a look at the stage, we'll see we have some sandal graphics, and these are similar to graphics used throughout this chapter. And if you go ahead and use your selection tool, click and drag and marquee, you'll see that these sandals are actually unconverted graphics. They're neither grouped, exist as a drawing object, and they definitely don't exist as a symbol yet in our Flash library. So the first thing we're going to want to do is actually convert these to a symbol and take a look at the process of setting up a registration point. Once again, if you haven't done so already, do exactly as we just did here and just marquee so that everything is selected on the stage. Alternately, you could use Command-A or Control-A to select all graphics on the stage. To convert this to a symbol, we're going to go up to the Modify menu, and we're going to choose Convert to Symbol. This opens up the Convert to Symbol dialog box, and here we get a chance to name our new symbol before we add it to the library. So we're going to go ahead and enter the name of Sandals. And we also get to choose a symbol type. We're going to keep it basic, and we're going to go with the most basic symbol type, which is a graphic. This allows us basically just to store and reuse this artwork throughout our movie and manage it from the library. For the folder, we're going to leave the library root since we haven't set up any folders yet in our library. So we're going to keep it simple. But what you'll notice is on the right side of the dialog box here, we have the registration point setting. The registration point is actually the point by which this graphic is measured and positioned on the stage. In other words, it's how Flash knows exactly where this is located on the stage relative to other graphics. You can see we can set a registration point here for any of the 4 corners, sides, or even the center. By default, Flash uses the upper left-hand corner. However, some people feel inclined to set a registration point in the center for some reason. Not quite sure why this is. Let's go ahead and set that registration point in the center and click OK to create our new graphic symbol. You'll see on the stage now that our sandal graphics are encompassed in a single bounding box, and if we take a look over at the property inspector on the right, it shows that the graphics are now a symbol. If we go ahead and click the library tab to bring the library panel forward, we'll see we have a single graphic symbol in our library called sandals, just as we named it. Let's go ahead and return to the properties panel by clicking that tab. Now, as mentioned, the registration point is significant because it's the point of the graphic, or of the graphic's bounding box rather, that Flash uses to position the graphic on the stage and kind of figure out where it is. You can think of the Flash stage as sort of a big piece of graph paper. Now, what we can do is, if we take these sandals and we kind of edge them up to the top, and you may need to scroll up just a bit, and you can either use your arrow keys or simply click and drag with your selection tool. Let's go ahead and move this up till the upper left-hand corner of the symbol's bounding box is matched with the upper left-hand corner of the stage. Now, what's interesting about this is technically this should be at absolute 0. The upper left-hand corner of the Flash stage is actually 0 and 0, if you think of an X and a Y axis, representing the horizontal and vertical position. But what's interesting, if we take a look over on the right-hand side on our property inspector, under position and size, it actually shows a very different setting. In our example file here, it shows 117 and change and 151.5. Now, this is kind of odd considering we've positioned the graphic in the upper left-hand corner of the stage. The reason is that Flash is not actually using the upper left-hand corner of the graphic symbol. Rather, it's using its registration point, which you may remember we set, for the sake of example, to the center. And you can actually see that registration point here. It's a white button and a crosshair sitting directly in the middle of the graphic itself. So how do we go about changing this registration point after the fact, if we want to make it easy for ourselves to measure the position of something on the stage, or if we want to make it easier to distribute and align graphics later on in the game? For this, we can't actually click and drag the registration point as you probably would feel inclined to do. So rather what we're going to do is we're going to actually edit the symbol itself, and that's how we're going to affect the registration point. To edit the symbol in place, simply double-click on the symbol, and you'll see what that does is it brings us into the symbol's edit mode. The registration point is represented here by simply a crosshair. Now, if we want this symbol to have an upper left-hand corner registration, what we need to do is actually reposition the graphics themselves relative to the registration point, which again is that crosshair. We could do this manually, but it's probably not going to be the most accurate way of doing it. The best way of doing it is to actually use the built-in Align panel in Flash. To open up the Align panel, what we can do is go up to Window and choose Align. You'll also notice that the Align panel should be available in the default workspace, and it's located right here in this icon group. Now, the Align panel allows us to align graphics to each other, but what's really handy is it also allows us to align graphics relative to the stage itself. Now, in this case, when we think about the stage, within a symbol, the stage, or rather the upper left-hand corner of the stage, is that registration point. So let's ignore actually what we're seeing here in the background, the actual stage area represented by the white box that we see, and let's almost think of this crosshair, this registration point, as the upper left-hand corner. So to align these graphics relative to that, we can actually use the Align panel itself. Now, the first thing we're going to want to do is actually group our graphics. If we have complex graphics like we see here, composed of both drawing objects, groups, and mergeable shapes, what we're going to want to do is group that so that all of those graphics get put together nicely in one bounding box. So with all of the graphics on your stage selected, go up to Modify and choose Group. And you'll see that helps us out a little bit by drawing a bounding box around the graphics and also grouping them together so they can be moved as one piece. If necessary, let's go ahead and re-expand that Align panel over on the right, and we want to make sure that Align to Stage checkbox is checked. That's going to be very important because right now we're not aligning to any other graphics, but rather we're aligning to the upper left-hand corner of the stage itself, or in this case, the registration point. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to align or automatically align the left edge of my graphics to the absolute left edge of the registration point by just clicking this first button. So you'll see the left edge of my group of graphics here becomes flush with the registration point. The next step is we're going to go ahead and do the same thing with the top of my grouped graphics. And we're going to do that by clicking this fourth button over, which is the Align Top Edge button. As soon as I do that, you'll see that the graphics become reoriented so that the upper left-hand corner of my grouped graphics are perfectly lined up with the registration point itself. So we're pretty much done here, and what we're going to do is we're going to go to the top of the stage and click that Scene 1 link to return back to the main timeline. And you'll see obviously our graphic is shifted a bit, but what's kind of nice is you'll see that the registration point is now actually where we'd like it to be, which is the upper left-hand corner of the symbol itself. Now this time, when we go ahead and take this graphic and we reposition it, and we put it up in the upper left-hand corner of the stage, you'll see if we take a new look now at the property inspector, X and Y are actually nearly 0, or pretty close to 0. And that's exactly what it should be, because now it's actually measuring the graphic's position using its registration point in the upper left-hand corner as opposed to the center. The center can be a really tricky place to put a registration point because it doesn't really give you an accurate idea of where the graphic is on the stage. This will come in especially handy down the line when you start distributing and aligning graphics in groups. If you have multiple graphics on the stage, if they all share a common registration point, and that registration point is accurate, it makes it a lot easier to do distribute and align operations, among other things. Now here's a little tip for you. You'll see that we move this manually up into the left-hand corner, but we can also use the Align panel once again, which we can re-expand here. And again, I can click those same two buttons, Align Left Edge and Align Top Edge, and you'll see that brings me to absolute 0 right here. So I know this is perfectly flush with the top and left edges of the stage. Now let's move ahead. We did mention that we were going to talk about transformation points, and very often people confuse the registration and the transformation point. One important difference is registration points are fixed for all instances of a symbol. It doesn't matter how many you drag on the stage, the registration point is something that cannot be shifted individually for each instance of a graphic. The proof of that is if we go ahead to the library here, click the tab, and we drag one more instance of our sandals to the stage, you'll see the registration point exists in the same area. Now what about the transformation point? If I click either of these sandals, what you're going to see is that the transformation point seems to exist in a couple of different places. Now the transformation point is actually this little button which you'll either see in the center or in different places around an instance of a symbol. And the transformation point can be different for every instance of a symbol, because sometimes you may want to rotate or transform a symbol from the center, from one of its four corners or sides, or whatever it happens to be. Let's go ahead and take a look at the first instance of our sandals by clicking on it. And let's go ahead and select the free transform tool from the tools panel on the right. You'll see it's the third tool down from the selection tool. You can also get to that by just simply hitting the Q key. Now what you'll see here is in the first instance of my symbol, my transform point actually is in the upper left-hand corner, which is kind of interesting. And that's not exactly what I want. If I want to rotate these, what's going to happen is if I grab any corner with my free transform tool, you'll see it kind of swings from that transformation point. So it's not exactly what we want. I want to be able to actually change this and rotate the sandals from the center to change their direction. The nice thing is we can do this. With the free transform tool active, I could simply move my pointer over the transformation point, which is that white button. I can click and drag it and reposition it anywhere around the graphic. I can actually even reposition it outside of the graphic, as you can see here, in order to set where I should rotate it from. So if I want to rotate it from the center, I'll position it in the center, release, and then next time I grab a corner to rotate it, you'll see that, hey, there we go. We can also do this from outside of the graphic. If I click and drag and grab and reposition that transformation point again, even if it's outside of the bounding box of the graphic, you'll see that it still works. Now I can do this on an instance by instance basis, so the sandals on the right can have a completely different transformation point. If I keep my free transform tool active and I click on the second set of sandals, you'll see this instance actually has the transformation point set in the center. Now from here, just like I did with the first set of sandals, I can drag and reposition this transformation point, and that determines where I can rotate the symbol from, or even scale the symbol from, like I'm doing here. I'm holding my shift key down, grabbing the upper left-hand corner, and you'll see it anchors all of the scaling right to that transformation point. Now you may be asking yourself, how come the transformation point was different for both sets of sandals to begin with? The answer is the transformation point tends to follow the registration point, and this is especially true for an instance of a symbol that's already been placed on the stage. Because I placed my sandals and changed the registration point after the fact while they were already on the stage, the transformation point drifted to follow. However, every subsequent instance of the sandals I placed put the registration point back in the center, which happens to be the default. So as we see here, the registration and transformation points for symbols are both very significant. However, they're not to be confused. Each one has a unique purpose, and it's important to know that registration points are fixed for all instances of a symbol, while transformation points can be manipulated on a case-by-case basis.